Natalie Brunell, thank you for being here today.
Thank you for having me. Looking forward to it.
Me too. You are, of course, a Bitcoiner and explain it so well. So I definitely want to ask you about Bitcoin, but you've also had such a fascinating life to me so far. So I want to start there with the story about how your family emigrated from Poland to the U.S. when you were five. It sounded like. So I'm curious, do you remember living in Poland, or is that too young?
See, I have very vague memories. I wish we could remember more from, our childhoods. I remember the neighborhood that we lived in, and we took a lot of trips when I was young because my parents would go to other countries, purchase merchandise, and then return to Poland and sell it. And so it was really interesting because at the time, Europe was not all on the euro currency. Every single country had a different one. So my parents would have to do the exchanges whenever they would go to these different countries. And I do remember being in the car a lot because we would have to wait at the border, and sometimes it
Mm.
would be like hours of waiting at the border to get into Hungary or Bulgaria or the different places we went. But I wish I remembered more from being young.
Um, how often do you go back to Poland now, or do you remember the first time? Have you guys been back?
Yeah, so the first time I went back, I think I was like 12 years old. I moved when I was 5, so it took a while because I think there was something with the visas and visiting and all of that. But I do remember going back. It was the last time that I was able to see my great grandmother before she passed
Mm.
away, and see the rest of our family, relatives and cousins, and it was a great trip. I mean, Poland is so beautiful and it's changed so much. It's actually really crazy talking to my parents today about the country because they left right as communism fell, and there was not a lot of hope or economic stability or opportunity, and that's why they wanted to come to the United States. But things have really changed there, and what's crazy is in terms of the standard of living, my parents' peers are actually living a better lifestyle than most people my parents' age here in the United States, and including
Oh,
my
wow.
parents, especially after they lost everything in the financial crisis. They were never fully able to recover. And so that's what's crazy to see because so many of their friends were so jealous, that they were moving to America, the land of opportunity, but
Yeah.
they didn't know that they would be the victims of the great financial crisis and go bankrupt, lose everything. And it's been really hard for them to recover, which is one of the reasons I'm so passionate about Bitcoin, because it speaks to the
Mm.
underlying problems in the system, but also my desire to hopefully help them so they don't have to worry about, money anymore.
Yeah, crazy. Yeah, what was it like for them growing up under communism? What was life like there?
It wasn't like a horrible life, but it was just there was no sense of economic mobility. So oftentimes people did exactly what their parents did. The income capped out at a certain level, and there was a really thriving black market. I found out
Mm.
later when I was interviewing my grandma before she passed away, about a year and a half ago. I interviewed her about her life in Poland, and she talked about how she was a cook, and there was a black market for meat and food products, and so she would sell beef on the black market, and she was able to accumulate enough cash to help my parents with their first home in Poland, which is just it's just
Oh,
crazy to think
wow.
about that kind
Yeah.
of stuff, right? But she was strong and powerful, and it's just they had a lot of economic challenges, and my mom has told me stories about how they would wait in line for basic necessities like food. And sometimes she remembers a story from when I was very little. I don't remember this, but she was holding me and waiting in line for food. And then we got up to the front and they had run out. Right, because there's constantly shortages under that type of government where the means of production, everything is controlled by the state, and so we went up to the ordering area and everything was gone by that point, and my mom
Mm.
said that I started to cry, and the lady right in front of us turned around and gave us some of her like sausage links so that I could
Wow.
have food. I mean, just crazy stories like that. So
It's so crazy. Well, it's also with the black market. It sounds like the free market has to like force its way into the cracks to try to
yeah, yeah,
fix things so people can survive, right?
right, exactly, yeah.
Um, What about your family's history going further back with your grandmother and stuff? Because Poland's got a they've got some tough neighbors historically over there with Germany and Russia. Like, what were some of the stories you heard about World War II and earlier than that, even?
Yeah, I mean, I don't. I wish I had more stories about my grandfather's side. My grandfather on my mom's side passed away before I was born, but a lot of the stories come from my maternal grandmother, and yeah, I mean, she basically survived during that time on the skin of potatoes. I mean, it was like extreme poverty and hiding. I mean, there was a story that my mom told me about how my grandma almost was taken actually to a concentration camp, and her father paid someone off so that she wasn't taken.
Whoa.
And so it was just really, you can't, we take for granted how privileged we have been, especially here
Yeah.
in the West. I mean, there are still so many problems, especially with our financial system. But truly, when you go back not that long ago, right, one or
Yeah.
two generations, people were living in situations of war, violence, poverty. And so we really do have to have some perspective and be grateful, and also study as much of that history so that it doesn't repeat itself.
Yeah. So you guys moved, it looked like just a couple of years after communism ended, right, in Poland,
Hmm.
and your parents are trying to get out of there for years and finally got
Hmm.
out in the early 90s. How did that happen? They finally were able to get to the
Yeah, I
US.
mean, it's so interesting because the border crisis is, front and center with the news right now, and immigration obviously is like such a hot button topic. And I can just say that my family waited for decades to be able to come here, and it was so difficult because they weren't able to just fly somewhere and try to trek across the border if they wanted to. They had to kind of sit and wait their turn and apply for a lottery system, and very few people get the chance to come. The way that my family was able to finally is because through a relative who was married to someone who was American, and so that was sort of the pathway
Man.
for us. But yeah, it's really tough. And then they came here, and the biggest part of that story that resonates with me is that my mom was 38 at the time, my dad was 41 when they finally had the chance to come, and my dad was really nervous for us to make that transition because he thought it was kind of too late. Maybe in their 20s
Mm,
it would have been easier and they could have
mhm.
still potentially tried to get an education and start over. But when you're in your late 30s, early 40s, and you have two children in tow,
Yeah.
it's hard, especially if you don't know the language and you don't have a lot of connections to secure employment or anything. So I admire their bravery to start over at that point in their lives, not knowing much and not having any guarantees, but knowing that they're going to have to work hard and sacrifice a lot for their kids to get an education in the US, which was always my family's dream for my brother and me. My brother had it a little tougher because we have a big age difference. So my brother was 16 when we came. I
Oh
was
man.
5. So
Mm,
I had it kind of easy in the sense that I could assimilate pretty quickly being a child and learn the language. It was tougher for
yeah.
my brother. He entered like smack dab in the middle of his sophomore year in high school, didn't know English,
Oh
was bullied a lot. It was hard.
yeah.
And so I really admire my parents for making that decision. And it was all about just that hope for a better life, the American dream opportunity.
So I did notice that you mentioned early on, and when I was reading about your backstory, I noticed the same thing, that like your family wanted to get out for decades under communism and finally gets out when communism's gone, and then you come to the
Yeah.
US,
Yeah.
and that's when we start failing into the financial crisis. I know that's probably 15 or so years
Yeah.
later, but um
Yeah.
do they have any regrets about moving here?
I think that that's really it's kind of the mixed feelings that they have. It's a mixed bag because on the one hand, they really did come for their children to have a better life, and
Hmm.
I think that they're really proud and grateful for the path that we are on. But at the same time, it was so hard for them to recover from the financial crisis that they did wonder for many, I mean, still maybe even today, they wonder what it would have been like if they hadn't left and what their lives would
Hmm.
look like there. And they've considered going back and
Hmm.
for retirement and all of that. But it's hard when you like,
Yeah.
shift your life away, you uproot yourself, you lose those connections and those bonds with the people you're close with, and start over here. So I think it's like it's a mix of both.
Yeah. Yeah. And then, um, so you were a journalist, and
Hmm.
it's you've sort of done a 180. I don't know if that's fair to say in the last few, say, 5 years or something, but you were the host, and now you're like the guest. So there's a 180 there, and then you
For
used to
sure.
be a journalist. Now you're a business owner. It seems like you've really changed how you go about life. Has that primarily been through learning about Bitcoin, or were there factors leading up to that? How did that all go down for you?
It's been a really interesting and fulfilling journey. I wanted to be a journalist ever since I was young. And I think part of that was because I loved stories. I grew up on stories. My mom would read me stories. And then I loved film and television. And when we were early here in the United States, we watched a ton of news programs because my parents always wanted to be up on current events, but also it was
Mm.
to help them learn English. So we always had the news on and that type of programming. So I admired the news women and anchor women that I would watch. And I thought it was just such a interesting, noble career because you get to tell stories, you get to learn, you get to interview people, you get to be on the front lines of history. And I was always
Hmm.
enamored by that career path. So I pursued it. And then I was in college when the great financial crisis hit. And that's
Hmm.
also an interesting point in my journey because I think it planted a seed that fueled me to be a more aggressive, intrepid reporter because I thought that there was just this great injustice that needed to be uncovered. I felt like the system was so unfair, to rigged to benefit the people at the top at the expense of everyone else, and that isn't
Hmm.
what I thought that the American dream stood for. And it isn't, right? It's not what this country was built on, and the foundation of individual sovereignty and freedom and self-determination. And so I was a very, very um, I would say motivated, ambitious reporter. And I pursued a lot of investigative pieces because I wanted to hold the powerful people accountable. And I think that's what
Hmm.
journalism should be. Today, it doesn't feel like it is as much, but we should be the people that are holding those in office, charged with being public servants, accountable, especially if they are committing financial crimes or enriching themselves at the expense of the public. So I was very intrigued by investigative journalism. And the interesting thing is, I didn't understand money. I think so many of us, even if we were good students and we pursued A's and all of that, I when I learned about Bitcoin, I realized how naive and ignorant I really was about how the financial plumbing worked and what fractional reserve banking was, how money was printed. I took for granted all of those things. I did not understand them. I didn't understand why prices just get more expensive every year. And I sort of accepted it the way everyone seems to. And Bitcoin was this really transformational moment for me. And it wasn't overnight. I didn't pick it
Hmm.
up overnight. I wish I did, but it took me years to realize how broken the money really is and how we do need a solution. Bitcoin's the best solution that we have in order to address these very pressing issues. And so I'm very grateful to be dedicated to educating people and focusing on this area because I think it empowers people. If you know about it, you can do something about it and you can empower yourself and you can save for the future. And I think that will, just fixing that and empowering people economically, will fix like 90% of the problems that exist. I
Hmm.
really do.
Yeah. Yeah. I went to business school, and I learned about Bitcoin much later and figured out I didn't know anything about money. And this is after going to business school, and I took
Yeah.
economics classes and all of that. It's pretty wild, actually. Like, if you can
Yeah.
learn Bitcoin first, the system's so simple, then you
Hmm.
can kind of build out from there, which is the fiat system is so amorphous and confusing, obviously by
Hmm.
design, I'm sure, that one's really hard to learn. And Bitcoin's actually really
Yeah.
simple, which probably most people would not understand that. But
Yeah.
so
Well,
let's.
it makes you think about incentive structures, like the power of incentives. And when you give all the power, the monopoly over money to the government, to the state, I mean, what are the incentives that you're creating and what are the consequences downstream? And so that's why I think
Mhm.
Bitcoin is so important, especially to share the message globally, since anyone in the world has access to Bitcoin. It's really this idea, this bigger idea of separating that power from the state and returning it
Mhm.
really to us and to the private market, which can create the most productivity because it knows how to allocate capital better than any state and centralized authority could.
Right. So let's talk about your Bitcoin story a bit then. So, do you remember when you first heard about it and what your impression of it might have been?
Yeah, so I was a reporter in Sacramento, California, covering the state capital, state politics in
Hmm.
California, which was really interesting because it's like the fifth largest economy, even though it's just a
Yeah.
state in the U.S. So I was focused a lot on breaking and investigative news, and then I had friends who lived in San Francisco who worked in Silicon Valley and had a lot of experience in the tech sector. And one day they were talking about Bitcoin and Coinbase and Mt. Gox, and I was super confused. And I
Mm.
was like, "What's that?" And so they kind of started to explain it to me. And of course, I, like so many people, thought if it's digital, it can be hacked. It can,
Mm.
it can be completely taken over by someone. It can go to zero. So I was extraordinarily skeptical, which is why I think I relate to the people in the audience who are coming in very new, very wary about the whole thing. And it wasn't until I read the Bitcoin Standard about 2 years after I heard about Bitcoin that I finally understood. But I do give myself credit that I bought some, but I was totally
Mm.
coming at it from a gambling speculation mentality. I thought, I'm not making enough money here as a reporter. And what if this thing does take off? What if it's like a lotto ticket? So I'm going to put a little bit of money into it. I opened up my first exchange account, and I never sold it. I mean, during that bull run, it went to 20,000 and then crashed back down. And
Wow.
I'm actually impressed with myself that I didn't sell. I rode my my first
Yeah.
market, from the top to the bottom, and then I learned about it through the Bitcoin Standard is what started that. And then I took in every single podcast, every single video, every book that I could get my hands on, and then that ultimately led to my podcast.
That my journey was similar, and I think it like I think people have to buy a little bit, whatever a little bit is to them first without knowing it, and then learn it. I'm not sure I've ever really like seen anyone learn it, totally get it, become a Bitcoiner, and then like start just purchasing it like constantly. And it seems like that's the path. Just put a little bit in and see what it does. Because then you're like, why is it doing this on the chart, right? In your
Yeah.
account? Like, why is it
Yeah.
going up and down so much? I don't understand.
Yeah.
Um,
I wish so badly that I had heard about it earlier, because there are stories of people who, my friends, who heard about it maybe in 2012 or 13 and they just didn't buy. But I know myself because 2009, 2010 was such like a big, um it was a pivotal kind of core memory moment for me with what my parents went through with the financial crisis. So
mhm.
if I had learned a little bit about Bitcoin early enough, I know I would have bought some just in case. But
Yeah,
you get Bitcoin at the price you deserve when you learn about it.
that's right. That's right. So, um, how do you then go about explaining Bitcoin to your friends and family? What's
I
your
mean, I think
pitch?
the biggest and yeah, the simplest way to think about it and the most powerful, I think, is as a savings technology. I mean, you could go down so many rabbit holes with Bitcoin, but I think the biggest problem that people have today is that the cost of everything's going up. Everyone's standard of living seems to be decreasing, despite the fact that they're working harder and getting promotions. I mean, look at the cost of things like healthcare and education and the cost to buy a home. Those are core, I mean, fundamental things in order to achieve the American dream. And yet they're becoming so out of reach, especially for young people. And so you don't even have to, go that far in depth about the history of money for people to understand and recognize that, hey, there is a problem here. Things are getting more expensive and wages are not keeping up with those rising costs. And so you could just show people the performance of Bitcoin. And even if you allocate a small percentage to this asset, which A is decentralized and B is absolutely scarce, it can significantly help you retain the purchasing power of what you work so hard to earn in whatever industry you work in, right?
Hmm.
And I think that something that's interesting that's happened is we've financialized so much, especially here in the US over, the 90s and early 2000s, where everyone basically has to become a day trader on the side or hire a money manager just to maintain the value of their money and try to get what, like a 5 to 7% annualized return. And that's just crazy. Like a hairdresser, an
Hmm.
accountant, a doctor, they shouldn't have to be money managers and earn their money twice, as Saifedean says in his
Hmm.
book,
Hmm.
Fiat Standard. It shouldn't be so hard, but it is because our money's like a melting ice cube because they keep printing more and more. So for me, I mean, I think the most powerful pitch is the idea of a savings technology, like this battery that you can plug your earnings into and allow it to grow in power and value as opposed to reduce. You can't leave your money in the bank anymore, and a lot of
Hmm.
people don't have the time or energy to start researching every single stock or becoming a real estate Airbnb landlord investor. And
Hmm.
so I think Bitcoin actually makes saving really simple.
Yeah. I'm curious with your um, interview with Michael Saylor in Madeira, which was awesome, by the way. Um,
Thank you.
so you call it a savings technology, which I agree with. Why do you think he calls it digital property instead of a currency, let's say, or he does call it savings technology, I'd say too. But what's his take on digital property as far as you see it?
Yeah, I mean, I think that property rights are fundamental, and we take for granted the fact that in so many countries, people don't have strong property rights, which is really the core of being able to not only accumulate but preserve capital. And so
Mm.
here in the United States, we have relatively strong property rights, and that was embedded in our Constitution. But when you think about it, I mean, how do you store value, the value of what you're earning and your investments for the long run? And primarily, we've shifted toward sort of well, we have our real estate, our houses have become our
Mm.
savings accounts. And then we have this sort of 60-40 traditional stock portfolio. We have a bunch of equities, and basically they've treaded along with the inflation. They've kept pace with about 7% of an annual money supply increase if you look at the base money supply. So I think what
Mm.
he's really touching on is this idea that you have to own property in order to be able to preserve capital for the long run. And it's not, I mean, it's amazing the fact that you can send Bitcoin from here to Nigeria or Italy at a moment's notice. But if it wasn't a powerful store of value, and if it didn't
Mm.
have that ability to take the money that you earn and retain and grow its value over the long run, I don't think that it would be as powerful of a tool. I think the store of value aspect is the most important thing about money because it allows you to plan for your future and allows you to use capital to create productive activities and to contribute to society. I mean, everything is really about production and providing value. So property has been the best way to store wealth. And I think that Bitcoin being a form of digital property that no one can revoke or confiscate from you is incredibly powerful. And then the secondary effect and benefit attribute is that you can also send it at lightning speed. So it takes
Yeah.
essentially the great aspects, attributes of gold, and now you can literally transport it digitally. And I just think it's an incredible piece of technology that people underappreciate because they don't understand not only Bitcoin, but they don't understand really money anymore. And
Yeah.
we live on a world that's based on credit, and we think that that's okay, that we can somehow sustain a system that constantly needs ever expanding credit to produce less and less real growth, but it's not sustainable, and we're only fooling ourselves. And we've had immense privilege being the global reserve currency, getting to issue all of that credit across the world, but property is what you really need in order to store and grow your wealth.
Mm. Yeah, it makes sense. I think like with our fiat money, I think we're so far off base. I'm not sure people even know that store of value is one of the functions of money because it hasn't been in so long.
Well, I mean, it's an interesting point that you're making because one of the things that I always thought was strange when I was a reporter is when the holidays would come around, we would judge the strength of the economy by how much people were spending, even if it was on credit
Mm,
cards. And
that's
I thought that
crazy.
that was really bizarre because basically the more everything's on credit, right? You get a house, you don't pay for the house in cash. You take on a mortgage and you take on student loan debt, and all of this has just been normalized and even incentivized.
Yeah.
That's your biggest tax break as an American citizen is the interest you pay on a mortgage. So we
Hmm.
incentivize people going into debt. We normalize it. We make it seem like it's no big deal. Our government obviously has no problem taking on more debt than it actually creates in terms of productivity and income. And I always thought, I mean, just simplistic thinking, common sense. I think the strength of the economy is how much people can actually save for their future so that they can spend
Right.
their money and not take on debt and spend basically, printed money that's numbers on a electronic spreadsheet. So I really think that the idea of saving is important. And when I really learned about economics and capitalism, I realized that that is the base layer. You don't take on debt that is essentially just, again, money created out of thin air. It has to be deferred savings, like someone worked, saved that, and
Hmm.
then can use it as capital later for productive purposes. But it has to be something that was deferred consumption rather than something printed out of thin air.
Yeah. Yeah. Did you see this guy Robert Sterling posted on Twitter this chart of the amount of time it took for $1 trillion to be printed in the U.S. or
Yeah,
sorry,
it was like 100
uh,
days, right?
U.S. debt. Yeah, it was like in the early '90s, it was 6 years, and then it was like 4 years, 4 years, 4 years, 3 years,
Yeah,
2 years, and the last 3 trillion have been about 60 to 90 days each.
yeah,
So it's just
yeah,
accelerating. Like, and
yeah.
where do you think that is going? Our national debt, like, how does that even make sense? And where, if that's accelerating, where does that end up?
Well, I mean, that's exactly going to my point earlier that you need ever expanding credit just to produce less and less real growth. And so Jeff Booth pointed out this in his book, Price of Tomorrow. How are we not a Ponzi? How you need more
Hmm.
and more just to produce actual less and less value, and you have to rob Peter to pay Paul. So yeah, we're going
Hmm.
into a debt spiral. There's the thing that's sad is this isn't a left or a right issue, and people turn to politics because they're so frustrated. They know something's wrong, they just can't identify what it actually is, so they're turning to left versus right, conservative versus liberal. It's really deeper than that, and money shouldn't be
Hmm.
political at all. And I think that unless we fix something, unless we move to a standard that returns us to fiscal restraint and a form of hard money, we're basically going to see the continual decline of what was once a great empire, but what is turning into, a system of debt servitude and people
Hmm.
slowly moving into poverty, and very few people at the top, right, with all the power, all the political and economic power, and I think that that's a very volatile, unstable position to be in because as the system comes apart and people feel more and more disenfranchised and unable to take care of themselves and their families, they will lash out, right? This is kind of the brewing ground for
Hmm.
revolutions and for physical violence because people start to feel really desperate. And I think that that's why we can see a lot more moral decay in our society as well. And people really, pulling apart. We have more and more mental health issues and people really struggling because people feel desperate. People feel like they are out of control. They no longer have a sense of control in your life, and really that does start with economic empowerment. I mean, I think that that's the most important form of control that someone can have, is being able to take care of themselves as well as the people around them financially and plan for their future so that they can drop their time preference and really think about the long term, as opposed to just living in the short term and taking advantage of anything they can in order to just survive and tread water. So that's, I think it's a really pressing issue that we need to
Hmm.
confront, because otherwise this won't be a country that many people want to live in. And we're ultimately going to concentrate more and more power in this vacuum of leaders who are going to come in pledging that they're going to save everyone, when really they're just going to take more and more power and freedom away from everyone.
Yeah. Um, so then if people you're helping, I'm sure a lot of people hear about, then get into Bitcoin, which helps fix a lot of this, which is huge. So if people are listening to this now, where do you think we are in the Bitcoin cycle right now? What's going on? It just went over its all-time high from a few years ago, and where are we, and where do you think it's going? What's happening?
We're at a really interesting point in the cycle because we've never hit an all-time high before the next halving. So that's, I mean, that on one hand is, I think, very bullish. And there's going to be that supply shock where fewer Bitcoin enter into circulation after about April 16th. So it goes from 900 a day to about 450. And so that's really the capacity of the miners to be able to offload that into a market that has increasing demand, especially with these ETF products. But at the same time, we have so much underlying weakness in the greater economy. If you look at the macro side, and if you look at what's happening with, it's the fact that we are at high interest rates, all this debt in the system, and yet we're hitting all-time highs in the stock market as well. I think that that's a little worrisome for a lot of people.
Yeah.
I think there are some aspects of that side of the economy that feels frothy and toppy, which may or may not bode well for something like Bitcoin. So that's
Mhm.
really, I think, the big question I have is, there's obviously going to be more and more demand for Bitcoin. And at some point, if something happens like with treasury dysfunction or a credit event, they're going to have to come in and taper over it and print money, which is good for
Mhm.
assets like Bitcoin. But in the middle, there's going to be a lot of volatility, I think, because we could sort of hit a cliff, and we could see bond yields surge, and we could see Bitcoin sort of reverse a little bit. I'm not sure how much before it ultimately takes off again. But I just hope that people don't focus on the short term so much, because again, in the long run, this system is only sustainable through issuing more debt and through more credit. We're going to
Right.
continue to debase this currency, and you need something as sort of a safe haven and as a life raft. And Bitcoin is the hardest money, and it's completely decentralized. So it is the best form of savings and capital. People just don't realize it yet. They're starting to wake up to it. But I'm surprised that there isn't more attention on Bitcoin yet, given the new all-time highs. I don't have a ton of phone calls from my peers
Yeah.
who are still not Bitcoiners saying, hey, what is how do I get in? I think that that's still coming. And so that means I think that Bitcoin still has a ways to go upwards.
Yeah. It feels like that to me too. Um, if people wanted to start learning about Bitcoin, where would you where would you send them first? And kind of what's the progression of the books you've read and all of that?
Mhm. Yeah, so I think it really depends on the type of medium that people most prefer to learn in, because there are so many great podcasts and videos and also books. So if you like reading, I always tell people to start with the Bitcoin Standard. I also love the book Price of Tomorrow, because it's really not a Bitcoin book. I think Bitcoin might be mentioned once in it, but it is a
Hmm.
fantastic overview of what's wrong in our current system and why the money supply has been increasing and things have become increasingly more expensive. If you like podcasts, I mean, certainly I hope people will check out mine. Peter McCormick
Hmm.
has a great show, Preston Pish. I mean, there are so many awesome podcasts out there. Sam Callahan has Swan Signal. So lots of great audio options as well. And then for video, I did a course with Swan. So if you go to swan.com/welcome, I did a 1 hour online video course that's completely free that you can get as sort of
Hmm.
like an introduction to Bitcoin. So it really just depends on how you want to learn. There are amazing resources out there, and I just encourage people to check them all out. Also, hope.com, which Michael Saylor put together with lots of resources there, including courses of his own. So yeah, a great place to start is really just online saying, what is Bitcoin?
Yeah, totally. And then, so I'll link to all those places. I will link to your podcast, which is great. I'd highly recommend that as well.
Thank
Your
you.
website. If people want to connect with you, where would you send them?
Yeah, so the best way is either through my Twitter, or I also have a website, talkingbitcoin.com. I do one-on-one and small group educational seminars and coaching, so I'm available for that as well. And my podcast is on there as well as all the other materials that I've worked on.
Awesome. Well, thank you so much for taking the time to come on today. I appreciate it.
Yeah, thanks for having me.